October 14, 1912. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Theodore Roosevelt stood on a platform preparing to deliver a campaign speech. A gunman stepped forward and fired a bullet directly into Roosevelt's chest at point-blank range. The bullet struck Roosevelt's steel eyeglass case and the folded 50-page speech in his breast pocket, slowing it down. But it still penetrated his chest, lodging near his lung. Roosevelt staggered but did not fall. He reached into his coat, felt for blood, and realized the bullet had not reached his lung. He looked at the crowd and declared, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." The crowd gasped. Aides rushed to help him. Roosevelt pushed them away. "But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose," he roared. Then he spoke for 90 minutes, with a bullet in his chest, before finally allowing doctors to examine him. This was Theodore Roosevelt. This was the man who became president at 42, charged up San Juan Hill, busted the trusts, built the Panama Canal, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and lived every day like it was his last adventure. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt, a story of transformation from sickly child to the most vigorous president in American history, of personal tragedy and relentless energy, of progressive reform and imperialist ambition, of a man who believed the presidency was a bully pulpit and used it to reshape America. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of the man who invented the modern presidency, who proved that government could be a force for justice, and who lived life at full throttle until his final breath. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt. Childhood and transformation. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born on October 27, 1858 in Manhattan, New York City, into wealth and privilege. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a wealthy glass importer and philanthropist, one of New York's most respected citizens. His mother, Martha Mitty Bullock, was a Southern belle from Georgia, beautiful and elegant. Theodore had an older sister, Anna, a younger brother, Elliot, and a younger sister, Corinne. They grew up in a 4-story brownstone mansion at 28 East 20th Street, surrounded by servants, wealth, and every advantage money could buy. But young Theodore, called Teddy by his family, was dying. From his earliest years, Theodore suffered from severe asthma. Night after night, he would wake gasping for breath, unable to get air into his lungs, terrified he was suffocating. His parents would rush to his bedside, his father holding him upright to help him breathe, his mother fanning him desperately. Asthma attacks left Theodore weak, exhausted, and unable to participate in normal childhood activities. He was small, frail, and sickly, a prisoner in his own body. Doctors could do nothing. Some nights, Theodore's father would take him on frantic carriage rides through New York streets at midnight, hoping the night air would help him breathe. "I could breathe, I could sleep, I could eat, and I enjoyed life," Roosevelt later wrote about those rare moments when the asthma subsided. Theodore was also nearsighted, severely so, but nobody realized it until he was a teenager. The world was a blur to him, contributing to his sense of physical inadequacy. But what Theodore lacked in physical strength, he possessed in intellectual curiosity and determination. Unable to play with other children, he read voraciously. He developed an obsession with natural history, collecting specimens of insects, birds, and small animals. By age 7, he had created the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History in his room, filled with carefully labeled specimens. Theodore wrote detailed observations in notebooks, sketched animals, and studied taxonomy. He was teaching himself to be a naturalist, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the natural world. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1870, when Theodore was 11 years old, his father took him aside for a serious conversation. "Theodore," his father said, You have the mind, but you have not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It was both a challenge and an ultimatum. Theodore accepted immediately. I'll make my body, he declared. Theodore's father built a gymnasium on the second floor of their home, equipped with weights, horizontal bars, and a punching bag. Theodore began a relentless program of physical exercise, lifting weights, doing chin-ups, boxing, hiking, riding horses, swimming in cold water, pushing his body to its absolute limits. It was brutal. His progress was slow, but Theodore never quit. It is hard drudgery, he wrote, but he attacked it with ferocious determination. Over months and years, Theodore transformed himself. His chest expanded. His arms and shoulders developed muscle. His endurance increased. The asthma attacks became less frequent and less severe. Theodore Roosevelt was literally building himself into a new person through sheer force of will, a pattern that would define his entire life. Harvard and tragedy in 1876. At age 17, Theodore entered Harvard College. He arrived as an eccentric, energetic student who wore loud checked suits, studied obsessively, boxed in the gym, collected specimens, and talked incessantly about everything from ornithology to naval warfare. Theodore was not popular with his classmates. He was too intense, too opinionated, too energetic. He couldn't sit still. He couldn't stop talking. He made strange barking laughs and gesticulated wildly when excited. But he was brilliant. He studied science, history, literature, and philosophy, graduating in 1880 with honors. He also fell in love. Her name was Alice Hathaway Lee, a beautiful 17-year-old from a prominent Boston family. Theodore met her in October 1878 and was instantly, completely, obsessively in love. He pursued Alice with the same manic energy he brought to everything else. Alice was initially uninterested. Theodore was strange, overly intense, and not particularly handsome. But Theodore's passionate persistence eventually won her over. They were engaged in January 1880 and married on October 27, 1880, Theodore's 22nd birthday. Theodore was ecstatic. "I am so happy that I dare not trust my own happiness," he wrote. He and Alice moved to New York, where Theodore entered Columbia Law School and began writing a naval history book. But Theodore found law boring. Politics, however, fascinated him. In 1881, at age 23, he was elected to the New York State Assembly as a Republican, representing Manhattan's 21st District. Theodore arrived in Albany as the youngest member of the legislature, a wealthy Harvard graduate in expensive clothes, mixing with rough political bosses and working-class representatives. They expected him to be a dandified fool. Instead, Theodore became a reformer, fighting corruption and demanding investigations of corrupt judges and city officials. He worked tirelessly, making speeches, writing bills, and building a reputation as an honest, if somewhat naive, young reformer. Then came February 14, 1884, the day that destroyed Theodore Roosevelt's world. Theodore was in Albany when he received a telegram, "Come home immediately." Alice was ill after giving birth to their daughter the previous day. His mother was also seriously ill. Theodore rushed to New York by train. He arrived at his family home on February 14 to discover unimaginable horror. His mother, Mitty, was dying of typhoid fever on the first floor. His wife, Alice, was dying of kidney failure on the second floor. Theodore spent the day racing between the two floors, holding first his mother, then his wife, watching both women die. His mother died first at 3:00 a.m. on February 14. Theodore ran upstairs to Alice. She died in his arms at 2:00 p.m. on February 14, 12 hours later. Theodore was 25 years old. His wife and his mother had died in the same house on the same day, just hours apart. In his diary that night, Theodore drew a large X and wrote one sentence: "The light has gone out of my life." Theodore Roosevelt was shattered. He could barely function. His infant daughter, also named Alice, was left in the care of his sister Anna. Theodore couldn't even look at the child. She reminded him too much of her mother. Theodore never spoke of Alice again. He removed every photograph of her from his home. He never mentioned her in his autobiography. It was as if he had erased her from his life entirely, unable to bear the pain of memory. Theodore needed escape. He needed to run from his grief. He needed to become someone else. So he went west to the Badlands of Dakota Territory to become a cowboy. The Badlands in September 1883, Theodore Roosevelt had visited Dakota Territory on a buffalo hunting trip. He had loved the wild, open landscape and the freedom of the West. Now, in 1884, grieving and desperate, he returned to the Badlands to start over. Theodore bought 2 cattle ranches and threw himself into the brutal, physical life of a cowboy. He worked alongside ranch hands, herding cattle, branding calves, riding horses for hours in blizzards and scorching heat, sleeping on the ground, eating terrible food, and living a life of pure physical hardship. The other cowboys mocked him at first. He wore glasses, spoke in an aristocratic Eastern accent, and talked about books and history. They called him Four Eyes and Storm Windows. Then they saw him work. Theodore could ride for 40 hours straight. He could work in freezing cold and blazing heat without complaint. He was fearless, tough, and tireless. When confrontations arose, Theodore didn't back down. Once in a saloon, a drunk gunman called Theodore Four Eyes and told him to buy drinks for everyone. Theodore knocked the man unconscious with 3 punches. The cowboys stopped mocking him. Theodore Roosevelt had earned their respect. For 2 years, Theodore lived mostly in the Badlands, ranching, hunting, writing, and slowly healing from his grief. He nearly died several times, lost in a blizzard, thrown from horses, chasing thieves who had stolen his boat. But the Badlands transformed him. The frail, asthmatic boy was now a hardened outdoorsman with leathery skin, strong hands, and absolute confidence in his physical abilities. He had remade himself once again. In 1886, Theodore returned to New York. The Badlands had saved him, but his ranches had been destroyed by the brutal winter of 1886–1887, which killed thousands of cattle across the plains. Theodore had lost most of his investment, but he had found himself, and he had fallen in love again. Edith and renewal in December 1885. While visiting New York, Theodore reconnected with Edith Kermit Caro, a childhood friend. Edith had known Theodore since they were children. She had always loved him, even when he married Alice. Theodore and Edith's romance was quiet, unlike his passionate pursuit of Alice, but it was deep and genuine. On December 2, 1886, Theodore and Edith were married in London. Edith became the stabilizing force in Theodore's life. She managed his household, raised his daughter Alice, who remained distant from her father, and eventually bore 5 more children: Theodore Jr. 1887, Kermit 1889, Ethel 1891, Archibald 1894, and Quentin 1897. Theodore adored his children and was a wildly energetic, indulgent father. He would lead them on scrambles through Rock Creek Park in Washington, climbing cliffs and wading through streams. He had pillow fights, played hide-and-seek in the White House, and read to them every night. "I play bear with the children almost every night," Theodore wrote, "and have a special bear noise when I come up behind them." Edith brought order, love, and stability to Theodore's chaotic life. Their marriage lasted until Theodore's death 33 years later. Rise to power: Theodore Roosevelt's political career advanced rapidly after his return from the Badlands. In 1889, President Benjamin Harrison appointed Theodore to the U.S. Civil Service Commission, where he fought corruption in government hiring. In 1895, Theodore became president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. He roamed New York streets at midnight in disguise, catching corrupt police officers sleeping on duty or shaking down citizens. His crusade against police corruption made national headlines. In 1897, President William McKinley appointed Theodore Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore immediately began preparing the Navy for war with Spain, which he believed was inevitable. When the Spanish-American War began in April 1898, Theodore was ecstatic. Here was his chance for glory and adventure. He resigned his position and volunteered for military service. Theodore organized the first United States Volunteer Cavalry, nicknamed the Rough Riders, a regiment of Western cowboys, college athletes, Native Americans, and adventurers. Theodore was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel, serving under Colonel Leonard Wood. On July 1, 1898, the Rough Riders participated in the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. Theodore, now commanding the regiment after Wood was promoted, led his men in a charge up Kettle Hill, then San Juan Hill, under heavy Spanish fire. Theodore rode his horse while his men advanced on foot. Bullets whizzed past him. Men fell around him. Theodore was fearless, shouting encouragement, waving his hat, leading from the front. The Americans took the hill. Theodore Roosevelt became a national war hero overnight. Newspapers celebrated Colonel Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Theodore loved every minute of it. "San Juan was the great day of my life," he later wrote. It was the adventure he had dreamed of since childhood. Theodore returned to America a celebrity. In November 1898, he was elected governor of New York by a comfortable margin. He was 40 years old and seemed destined for greatness. The accidental president as governor of New York from 1899 to 1900, Theodore Roosevelt was a whirlwind of energy and reform. He fought corrupt political bosses, regulated corporations, improved working conditions, and drove Republican Party leaders to distraction with his independence. New York's Republican boss, Thomas Platt, wanted Roosevelt out of New York. The solution? Bury him in the vice presidency, a position with no real power. In 1900, Theodore was selected as William McKinley's running mate in the presidential election. Theodore didn't want the job. He called the vice presidency a splendid bore, but he accepted out of party loyalty. McKinley and Roosevelt won easily. Theodore became vice president in March 1901. He was miserable. The vice presidency had no power, no influence, nothing to do. Theodore was bored and restless. Then, on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was shot by an anarchist assassin while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Initially, McKinley seemed to recover. Theodore was vacationing with his family in the Adirondack Mountains when he received word that McKinley was improving. Theodore went hiking on Mount Marcy, New York's highest peak. On September 13, while Theodore was descending the mountain, a guide raced up the trail with a telegram. President McKinley was dying. Theodore had to reach Buffalo immediately. Theodore rode horseback through the night, then took a train to Buffalo. He arrived on September 14, 1901, to learn that William McKinley had died. Theodore Roosevelt, at age 42, was now President of the United States, the youngest president in American history. Republican Party leaders were horrified. Senator Mark Hanna reportedly lamented, "Now look, that damned cowboy is president." Theodore was about to prove them right to worry. The square deal Theodore Roosevelt entered the presidency with characteristic energy and a determination to use presidential power aggressively. He believed the president should be a steward of the people, actively promoting the public good rather than passively executing laws. Roosevelt's domestic policy became known as the Square Deal, a promise that every American, rich or poor, would get a fair chance. His reforms transformed American society. Trust-busting, Roosevelt went to war against the giant corporations, called trusts, that dominated American business and crushed competition. In 1902, he ordered the Justice Department to sue the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad trust controlled by J.P. Morgan under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Morgan was outraged and traveled to Washington to meet Roosevelt. "If we have done anything wrong," Morgan said, "send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt replied coldly, "That can't be done. We don't want to fix it up," Attorney General Philander Knox added. "We want to stop it." The Supreme Court sided with Roosevelt, ordering the Northern Securities Company dissolved. Roosevelt had proven that the government could control corporate power. Over his presidency, he brought 44 antitrust suits, earning the nickname Trust Buster. The coal strike of 1902. In May 1902, 140,000 Pennsylvania coal miners went on strike, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. The mine owners refused to negotiate. As winter approached, America faced a coal shortage that could freeze the Northeast. Previous presidents had sided with business owners and used troops to break strikes. Roosevelt did something revolutionary. He threatened to seize the mines and have the army run them unless the owners negotiated. The owners, shocked, agreed to arbitration. The miners won a 10% pay raise and shorter hours. Roosevelt had forced capital and labor to compromise. The first time a president had intervened in a labor dispute without automatically siding with business. Conservation. Roosevelt was America's first conservationist president. He loved nature, believed wilderness had intrinsic value, and feared that America's natural resources were being destroyed by unchecked exploitation. During his presidency, Roosevelt established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird sanctuaries, and 150 national forests. He protected approximately 230 million acres of public land, an area larger than Texas and California combined. Roosevelt worked closely with Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, to establish the principle that natural resources should be managed scientifically for long-term sustainability, not exploited for short-term profit. Food and drug regulation. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel exposing horrific conditions in meatpacking plants. Roosevelt, disgusted by what he read, invited Sinclair to the White House and ordered an investigation. The investigation confirmed Sinclair's allegations. Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906, establishing federal regulation of food and medicine for the first time. Roosevelt's Square Deal transformed the relationship between government, business, and citizens. He established the principle that government could regulate the economy in the public interest, a revolutionary idea that conservatives fought bitterly. Foreign policy and the Panama Canal. Theodore Roosevelt believed America should be a great power on the world stage. His foreign policy motto was an African proverb: "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Roosevelt expanded the U.S. Navy, making it the second most powerful in the world. He sent the Great White Fleet, 16 battleships, on a voyage around the world from 1907 to 1909 to demonstrate American power. But Roosevelt's greatest foreign policy achievement, and his most controversial action, was building the Panama Canal. For centuries, ships traveling between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had to sail around South America, a dangerous 13,000-mile journey. A canal through Central America would cut that to 50 miles. The French had tried to build a canal through Panama in the 1880s, but failed spectacularly, with over 22,000 workers dying from disease and engineering disasters. Roosevelt was determined to succeed. There was one problem. Panama was part of Colombia, and the Colombian Senate had rejected the U.S. treaty to build the canal. Roosevelt was furious. He called the Colombians foolish and homicidal corruptionists who were blocking human progress. In November 1903, Panamanian rebels, with Roosevelt's secret encouragement and American naval support, revolted against Colombia, the U.S. Navy prevented Colombian troops from reaching Panama to suppress the rebellion. Within days, Panama declared independence. The United States immediately recognized the new nation. 15 days later, Panama signed a treaty giving the U.S. the rights to build and control the Panama Canal. It was imperialism, pure and simple. Roosevelt had fomented revolution to seize territory for an American project. He later boasted, "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate." Construction began in 1904. Under the leadership of Army engineer George Goethals and Dr. William Gorgas, who conquered yellow fever and malaria, the Panama Canal was completed in 1914. One of the greatest engineering achievements in history. Roosevelt considered it his greatest accomplishment. Critics considered it his greatest crime. The Nobel Peace Prize, ironically, Roosevelt won the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize, the first American to receive it, not for war but for mediating peace between Russia and Japan after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Roosevelt hosted both sides at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and negotiated the Treaty of Portsmouth, ending the war. It was a diplomatic triumph that enhanced American prestige and Roosevelt's reputation as an international statesman. The election of 1904 and second term in 1904, Theodore Roosevelt ran for president in his own right. He had served 3 years of McKinley's term and wanted a full term of his own. Roosevelt won in a landslide, defeating Democrat Alton Parker with 336 electoral votes to 140. Roosevelt won 56% of the popular vote, a decisive mandate. On election night, Roosevelt made a fateful pledge. He would not run for president again in 1908. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Roosevelt's second term continued his progressive agenda. He pushed for railroad regulation, pure food and drug laws, and conservation. He mediated labor disputes, prosecuted trusts, and expanded American influence abroad. But as his presidency neared its end, Roosevelt realized he wasn't ready to stop. He was only 50 years old, full of energy, and convinced he had more to accomplish. Roosevelt kept his promise not to run again in 1908, but he handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War and close friend. Roosevelt believed Taft would continue his progressive policies. Taft won easily in 1908. On March 4, 1909, Theodore Roosevelt left the presidency at age 50. He was restless, energetic, and bored, a dangerous combination. Safari, return, and the bull moose immediately after leaving office, Roosevelt embarked on an African safari. Spending nearly a year hunting big game and collecting specimens for the Smithsonian Institution. He killed over 500 animals, including 9 lions, 8 elephants, and 13 rhinos. Roosevelt then toured Europe, giving speeches, meeting kings and emperors, and receiving a hero's welcome everywhere he went. When he returned to America in June 1910, over 1 million people greeted him in New York City. But Roosevelt returned to find American politics in turmoil. President Taft, under pressure from conservative Republicans, had abandoned many of Roosevelt's progressive policies. Taft had fired Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's conservation ally. He had supported high tariffs that benefited big business. He seemed to have betrayed everything Roosevelt stood for. Roosevelt was furious. The friendship between Roosevelt and Taft disintegrated into bitter enmity. In 1912, Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. It was an unprecedented move, a former president running against his hand-picked successor. Roosevelt won most of the Republican primaries, but Taft controlled the party machinery. At the Republican convention in Chicago, party bosses awarded the nomination to Taft through procedural manipulation. Roosevelt's supporters were outraged. They walked out of the convention and formed a new party, the Progressive Party. Nicknamed the Bull Moose Party after Roosevelt declared he felt as strong as a bull moose. The 1912 election became a three-way race: Republican Taft, Democrat Woodrow Wilson, and Progressive Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt campaigned with manic energy, giving speeches across the country and attacking both Taft and Wilson. His platform called for women's suffrage, labor protections, trust regulation, and social welfare programs, a radical progressive agenda. Then came Milwaukee on October 14, 1912, when Roosevelt was shot in the chest and gave a 90-minute speech with a bullet lodged near his lung. Despite his heroism, Roosevelt lost the election. The Republican vote split between Taft and Roosevelt, allowing Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win easily. Roosevelt won 88 electoral votes, more than Taft, but Wilson won with 435. Roosevelt had split the Republican Party and handed the presidency to the Democrats. Final years and death after his 1912 defeat, Theodore Roosevelt was 54 years old and politically finished. He refused to accept it. In 1913–1914, Roosevelt embarked on a disastrous expedition to explore an uncharted tributary of the Amazon River in Brazil, the River of Doubt. The expedition nearly killed him. Roosevelt contracted malaria and a severe leg infection. He suffered from fever, delirium, and blood poisoning. At one point near death, Roosevelt urged his companions to leave him behind so he wouldn't slow them down. They refused. Roosevelt survived the expedition, but it permanently damaged his health. He lost 50 pounds and never fully recovered. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, Roosevelt demanded American intervention on the side of Britain and France. When President Wilson kept America neutral, Roosevelt attacked him mercilessly, calling him weak and cowardly. After America entered the war in 1917, Roosevelt begged Wilson to let him raise a volunteer division and lead it to France. Roosevelt was nearly 60 years old and in failing health, but he desperately wanted one more military adventure. Wilson refused. Roosevelt was heartbroken. Roosevelt's 4 sons all served in World War I. His youngest son, Quentin, a pilot, was shot down and killed over France in July 1918. Roosevelt was devastated. Quentin's mother and I are very glad that he got to the front and had a chance to render some service before his fate befell him, Roosevelt said publicly. But privately, he was shattered. Roosevelt's health deteriorated rapidly after Quentin's death. He suffered from inflammatory rheumatism, was partially deaf in one ear and blind in one eye, and had recurrent infections from his Amazon expedition. On January 5, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt went to bed at his home in Oyster Bay, New York. During the night, a blood clot formed in his heart. On January 6, 1919, at 4:15 a.m., Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. Vice President Thomas Marshall said, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." Legacy Theodore Roosevelt's funeral was held at Oyster Bay on January 8, 1919. He was buried in a simple grave in Young's Memorial Cemetery, next to Quentin. Edith survived him by nearly 30 years, dying in 1948. Roosevelt's legacy is enormous and complicated. He transformed the presidency from a passive office into an active force for change. He established the principle that government should regulate business in the public interest. He created the modern conservation movement and saved millions of acres of wilderness. He made America a world power. But Roosevelt was also an imperialist who believed in American and white supremacy. He seized Panama through revolution. He dismissed Native Americans as inferior. He believed some races were destined to rule others. Roosevelt was progressive on economic issues but conservative on race. He invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House, the first African American to dine there. But he also dishonorably discharged black soldiers without trial after the Brownsville Affair of 1906. Roosevelt's energy, courage, and joy in life remain inspiring. He read a book a day, often before breakfast. He hiked, boxed, hunted, explored, and lived at full intensity every moment. He wrote 35 books. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He became president at 42 and reshaped America. "Do what you can with what you have where you are," Roosevelt said. He lived that philosophy absolutely. Theodore Roosevelt proved that one person, through sheer force of will and relentless energy, can change the world. He showed that government can be a force for justice. He demonstrated that leadership means action, not passivity. But he also showed the dangers of self-righteousness, imperialism, and the belief that might makes right. Theodore Roosevelt was the most vigorous, energetic, and consequential president of the early 20th century. He expanded democracy and freedom for some while imposing American power on others. He saved wilderness while celebrating conquest. He was both hero and imperialist, progressive reformer and racial chauvinist. This is the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt, the president who could not be stopped, who lived more intensely than any president before or since, who transformed a sickly child into a force of nature through sheer determination. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt, the bull moose, the rough rider, the trust buster, the conservationist, the man who charged up San Juan Hill, built the Panama Canal, won the Nobel Peace Prize, got shot and kept speaking, explored the Amazon, and lived every day like it was his last great adventure. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt.